have the slides, please? Well, I can start saying that at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, we are dedicated to the study and mitigation of risks that could lead to human extinction or civilization collapse. And I guess that you may be wondering, where are the slides? But you will also maybe wondering which type of events are the ones that can bring humanity to this type of civilization collapse or human extinction. So if we go to the third slide, you can see more or less some images that can lead you to think what I'm talking about. So such events are, for example, the misuse or unintended consequences of artificial intelligence, bioweapons, including human-engineered pandemics, for example, nuclear war, highly disruptive volcanic eruptions, extreme climate change, ecological collapse, and even asteroid impact. And of course, this is a lot of research that is being produced in our center, and you may be wondering, how do you go from here to something more applied and start doing science advice? Next slide, please. And at CSER, what we are trying to do is to focus our work in our policy engagements with 3 different stakeholders that may be different, but they are they are equally important for us. So we work with civil society that goes from advising NGOs to political parties, professional associations, even universities, also to the public sector, which will be any institution that belongs to the government at different local, national, and international levels, and also with the industry. So we will be dealing with from startups to businesses in biotechnology, agriculture, and even in IT. Next slide, please. So what I thought to do this time, because I saw the presentations of my colleagues, was to focus a little bit about examples, some examples, because I know that some of you may be interested on how to start or what can you do to start learning more about how to do successful and impactful policy engagements. So something that has happened to me since the last year that I started is that I have done some sort of policy engagements through different pathways. And that's something that I have realized that that's how it happens. It's not a protocol that you follow. You just have to find like all the different paths that will lead you to a successful policy engagement. In this case, in this slide, I would like to talk about how to do it through science brokers. And by science brokers, I mean by an institution that can be the bridge between you, the academia, and policymakers. For example, in March of last year, the Science and Technology Office of the Parliament in the UK launched an COVID-19 outbreak expert database. And they invited anyone who wanted to support the UK Parliament in its work and had expertise in COVID-19 to register. After that, they sent us an online survey to all the experts. We were around 1,100, and with the results from that survey, this office could produce 15 reports that were talking about the short, medium, and long-term concerns of experts that have in different areas that went from vaccine development to education, health, etc. Other science broker that I have been working on is Alpenglow, which is formed by ex-civil servants, and now they are trying to put long-term thinking at the head of policy making. And we have been helping them in different type of white papers, or sometimes they have requests from the cabinet office that they want to know a little bit more about, for example, safety on artificial intelligence. So CSER experts are sent there to inform there and give short advice about that. Next slide, please. Other type of engagements are as something that I call through direct initiatives. So in this case, I will be talking about, for example, when CSER is contacted directly and invited to present evidence to the UK Parliament. In this case, Catherine Rhodes, which is the director of the center, was invited to talk about biorisk and bioweapons and advise the House of Lords. And on the picture on the right, you can see a submission that I did with some colleagues. And it was an open call, because maybe you have this type of mechanisms in your country, but in the UK, they have these open calls for evidence. So in this case, the House of Lords is going to write a report by November, if I'm not mistaken, and they want to know more about emerging risks and how the UK can deal with them in a better way. So we decided to focus on foresight methods. We wrote 6 pages, very short, talking about what are the methods that we have in-house and how we have used them in the past, giving examples of how they can be applied at the House of Lords. Next slide, please. Another initiative that I have been working recently is with the All-Party Parliamentarian Group for Future Generations at the UK Parliament. And right now we are having, today I have my 5th meeting with them because we are helping them to redraft a bill for future generations, the well-being of future generations. And this is something, a really nice story, because CSER, the place where I work, has been the main promoter of the future generations idea in the UK, because, or in England, because everything started with Natalie Jones, which is a colleague of mine, that wrote a paper about why we should think about coming up with an all-parliamentarian group about that, and then that the creation of a bill can happen, and this happened some years ago, and now we can see that it finally happened, and we are supporting this this initiative. Next slide, please. And talking a little bit more about what you can do outside your own country, I wanted to bring 2 examples on this slide. I was involved with the G20, more specifically with the Science 20 team, which is a group that is in charge to gather the whole global scientific community through the national academies and advise the G20 leaders. So we did that. We got together. We had also some surveys, some meetings, even webinars together. And the outcome of those conversations are the report that you can see on the left, Foresight, Science for Navigating Critical Transitions, that I invite everyone to take a look. There is a lot of examples of how foresight is being used in different parts of the world, and why is it important that we think about how to implement this in science advice. On the right side, I will talk a little bit about my involvement with the World Economic Forum. I'm part of the Global Future Council on Frontier Risks. And one of our first jobs, let's say, was to support the Global Risk Report, which is an annual study published by the World Economic Forum ahead of the forum's annual meeting in Davos in Switzerland, and is based on the work of the Global Risk Network. And the report describes changes occurring in the global risk landscape from year to year. And what we did was to add a little bit of our expert collective intelligence with the group, let's say. And what we did was to prepare a list of future scenarios. For example, we described very short future worlds where genome editing has overpower us, or where the melting of the permafrost has released new viruses, and we are having like a new COVID-19 with viruses that we have never seen before, for example. And the idea to do this was to encourage more expansive thinking about the universe of risk possibilities in the next decade. And of course, we want to do it, what we really want to do is to enable preparation rather than paralysis, as well as resilience in the frontiers of risks. Right now, with the Global Future Council, we're working on a white paper about risk pathologies and potential pathways for redress. And you may know that WEF is really good at multi-stakeholder efforts. And I joined this Future Council because I think that what we need is not just academia and governments, but we also need the industry. And all together with citizens, we probably can find more innovative solutions. Next slide, please. Yes, another way that you can also be involved in science advice and contribute in that sense is joining different committees. And in this case, I'm, for example, engaged with the International Science Council and the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction as an expert reviewer. And what we are doing right now is to have a group of meetings where we talk about redrafting, again, a new research agenda for the Sendai framework. So the Sendai framework is an agreement signed by many countries about global risk, and the research agenda is the one that is sort of like the guide of this framework. Next slide, please. Yes, and well, with this slide, I want to mention that because my background is on molecular biology, I'm very familiarized with, let's say, bioweapons, and that's why I'm very connected with the United Nations Biological Weapon Convention, and I have been helping them, for example, training young scientists from the global south to learn more about science diplomacy, about science advice. But in this case, in the figure on the picture on the left is a presentation that I made for the meeting of experts when all the countries get together, and I just I propose some initiatives on how they can strengthen their work at the BWC. On the picture on the right, it was a presentation I had some months ago at the Mexican Parliament, because they are trying to understand more, for example, how is the science advice happening in the UK, because they are trying to also implement their own in there, and they invite us to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Okay, so this part is just for you to think a little bit about what can you do at your institution. So, for example, at my institution, I decided that we should improve our knowledge management, because around, let's say, 40% of our experts engage in policy, but the other 60 not. So maybe there is a lack of sharing of knowledge or understanding what science advice is or science diplomacy is. So what I did was to conduct a series of interviews and surveys and wrote a report. And right now you are just seeing the raw data because it's with a designer, but I will hopefully soon be sharing the nice report. And what I did was to collect the best study cases that CSER, where I work, has in terms of impactful science advice. And we have like 7 examples, and I have divided into what was the process, step by step, like a guide on what things that you can do, and what are the skills and methods that can help you to have a very successful one. Another thing that I did was to, with my colleague, was to map the different organizations that we have been having engagements within UK, governments outside the UK, civil society, industry, etc. Next slide. Yeah, something that I also find that is very important is to understand what are the outputs, what can your scientific academic knowledge can contribute to. So I also collected all these outcomes, and for example, one of them is contribute to the European Commission's white paper on artificial intelligence, help a startup to define what are going to be their ethical values, report on recommendations for the UN high-level panel on digital comparison. So this, I think, it makes you to bring down to earth about how your science advice can really contribute to the real world. And something that we also did was to create a scorecard, trying to make researchers at our center to think about the co-creation, co-production, and co-delivery of knowledge. So at different stage of their research, we are giving them different statements to think about that may in the future help them to develop more impactful policy engagements. Next slide, please. Finally, I just want to mention that in this report, one of the things that we also included was a clear definition of what policy impact is and what's the difference with research impact. What are the different stakeholders that we work with? What are the hot topics, let's say, like the topics in demand in our own field of study, which is global catastrophic and existential risk? How to get started, some ideas of how our colleagues got started on this. Some of them was because they did an expert elicitation and then they were later invited to that. The other ones were continually looking for this opportunity, so we write all that. What are the skills that you need for doing this type of work? What are the don'ts, that you don't have to do during these policy engagements? And we also want to be transparent. There are good and bad when you embark in these kind of things. So we also have a list of the benefits, but also disadvantage of engaging in policy. Next slide, please. And we finally end up the report, but just thinking, what can we do better as an institution? And if we want to have more, that our research is not just left out in the academic world where maybe 10 people is going to read it, but we want more policymakers, more citizens, more CEOs reading about our work and thinking, how can I apply this to my own institutions. So one of the recommendations that we have in the report are to come up with a strategic annual plan for policy work, when to do it, how to do it, and why. And we also think that we could come up with more workshops, knowledge sharing, journal clubs, and then to come up to bring up more study cases. And one study case that has recently was brought to my attention was, maybe you have heard about the report from Partha Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity. So in this case, the UK Cabinet Office requests this academic to come up with this report, and it was launched having Boris Johnson, having the Prince Charles talking about it, and it's going to be used on changing their policy. So I thought that's a fantastic study case to learn how it started, what are the don'ts, what are the tips and recommendations that we can have. Another thing that you can do to improve your policy engagements at your institution could be to create a policy board. In the same way that you have like an academic board to help you, to guide you, maybe a policy board can support you and motivate you to have more policy engagements. And we also realize that we have to have a better monitoring. Sometimes we are asked to give science advice, but then it takes 6 months until we see an outcome, and sometimes we forget or we don't follow because we have so many policy engagements. So my last thing will be just to bring your attention to this figure on the right. This is a comic that we did because we are also constantly thinking, what can we do to improve our policy engagement? How can we reach more people in a faster and more efficient way that captures their attention and trigger emotions, which is the most important thing when you want someone to really pay attention. And this is based on a scientific article about bioengineering and foresight that we did. And it talks about future scenarios and how the world could look. So that was like a good hook for many people to be interested on the paper. So I guess that my next slide is just to say thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can reach us through Caesar, or you can reach directly to me, and I'll be more than happy to connect with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Clarissa. Amazing presentation there. And I'm surprised you can get your day job done with all the advice you're giving. But one question for you.